So thank you, and it's good to see all of you and to be back in Boston. And even though it's not great weather, it's better weather than when I was here last. Last time I was here, there was a snowstorm and a blizzard, and so it was not the most pleasant time to be in Boston. But I think the work you're doing here at this fabulous building and the work all of you are doing in thinking about transportation, to me is quite important. So it was a delight to come back, and today I met with some black philanthropists and been meeting with the Heinz Foundation and the Bar Foundation. And I know Boston is sort of in another boom, another growth spurt. And the question of how do you deal with that actually is important. And so what I'm going to do is actually take you on a circuitous journey, and I'll get to transportation toward the latter part of the journey. But as suggested, one of the issues I focus on a lot is issues of equity, but probably from an unusual perspective. I think it's actually much more important and significant than when we think of, not just for transportation, but for the health of our country, and I would even say the health of our world. And I can talk more about that later. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some things that you probably haven't heard about in the transportation context. One of them being implicit bias, another one being what I call structural marginalization or structural racialization, and then ways to actually think about that forward. So one is naming where we are, but then two, moving forward. And then lastly, what does that mean in terms of transportation? How do we actually begin to address some of those issues in terms of transportation? So one way of thinking about this, of course, is you want to build something that's inclusive. And while I'll focus on race, I wouldn't limit it to race. To be inclusive looks at all the different populations and recognizing that to be inclusive, we have to be deliberate. It won't happen naturally. And there are reasons why this won't happen, and the reasons are multiple. So some of the reasons may have to do with costs. Some of the reasons may have to do with access. Some of the reasons may have to do with other things like bias and something I call the circle of human concern, and the way we think about the other, if we do think about the other. So in the context of race, and race is one of those things that it just won't go away. You know, it keeps coming back up, and it comes up in different forms. And in many ways, we sort of think about it a lot. And I sort of compare this to gravity. Like, most of us have weight, but very few of us are really experts on gravity, right? So we all sort of in some way have thought about race. We have a race, but actually it's actually quite complex. It's like gravity. To really think about it in a nuanced way, and in a way that actually situates it in terms of the day's discourse, really requires some pretty profound thinking that actually we have not been trained to do. We've actually been trained to think about race in a very simplistic way that doesn't serve it or us very well. And sometimes I talk about race is actually a verb. It's not a noun or an adjective so much as a verb. It's a set of practices. It's actually what we do in our social location. And that for a population to have a race, it has to be raced. So something has to happen. And we're talking about how we locate people within social location. So what is the practice that locates people based on some ascribed characteristics that's race? Now, it may seem strange that I'm talking about this now. I gave a talk at the Democratic Convention when the first time that Senator Obama was running for president. And I said, if he wins, and I hoped that he would, and supported him, but I said, if he wins, it's a good chance, unless we're very careful, that we're entering a period of heightened racial anxiety. And literally, I had some funders, I have to raise money for some of the work I do, I run these institutes, actually defund me. They said, you know, you're just obsessed with race. You know, if Obama wins, we're going to be done with race. We're going to be in this post-racial world. And I said, I'm not saying we will have more racial anxiety. I said, there's a good chance. And about 2 years later, after the midterm elections, and all the stuff started coming out, some of them came back to me. And they said, how did you know? And so one of the things that's confusing is that we have more racial tolerance at an explicit level, and yet more racial anxiety at an implicit level. So we have these two different phenomena happening at the same time, and we don't have a very good way of understanding it. So that's what's happening in terms of our sort of internal processing of race. But beyond that, so now we have a black person in the White House is not cooking. And, you know, I don't know if Obama can cook or not, but anyway, at the same time, we're having this explosion in the criminal justice system. Since Obama's been president, we've had the wealth gap between white Americans and black Americans go from 10 to 1 to 20 to 1. We've had the wealth gap go in the Latino and white community go from 9 to 1 to 18 to 1. That's why we have a black person in the White House. So structurally, there's something going on. And if you read the New York Times today, they talked about disproportionality in schools between blacks and whites. But they weren't talking about high school or even junior high school. They were talking about preschool. And they were talking about difference in terms of funding. This is 2014. So part of the thing that I draw people's attention to is to say, we have to look and see what our structures are doing. That's not the way we normally think about race. We normally think about race, we think about what are we consciously engaged in, what we consciously think. And in some ways, I would say that's the least interesting and least important way of understanding the current racial dynamics. So then racialization, and I use racialization, some of my friends say, you know, why do you use that word? And I said, I like it, I made it up. So, but also I use that more than I use the term racism. So racialization is sort of looking at a set of practices and norms and that produce racialized outcomes. And again, some of my friends say, why don't you just call it racism? And I said, because it's not racism. It's not racism in the way that we normally think of it. It's not racism in the sense of an individual having animus toward a particular group and then acting on that animus in some way. It's basically saying there's certain practices and norms that produce outcomes. Now that's important because in order to sort of understand what those practices and norms are doing, we have to look at them. We have to be aware of them. And usually we don't do that, especially in the context of race. And this actually takes us into a systems approach. I had a talk with Angela earlier today, and we're talking about the minimum wage, and I know this is a big issue here in Massachusetts and in Boston. And the assumption is that if you raise the minimum wage, you actually help people, and you help people of color more than any other group. That may not be true because there's some group, people are situated differently, we'll talk about this more, people are in systems. And to raise minimum wage may actually mean that someone lose other benefits, and the wash may be that they're worse off than they were to begin with. And so you have to really sort of look at how multiple things interact in a dynamic way and in a nonlinear way. And that's a system. And so part of it is to understand what a system is doing. And a system is doing something sometimes by design and sometimes in unintended ways. None of us intend, when we get in our cars and start it up in the morning, none of us intend to have an effect on the environment. And yet collectively we do. So it's an unintended consequence. Nonetheless, it is a consequence. And once we know that consequence exists, we have a responsibility to act on it. So when we see that things aren't turning out like we thought they would, we have a responsibility to understand it better and to actually do something about it. Now, this is an old discussion and a new discussion. In some ways, when we talk about housing segregation, a house is the hub of a system. So where you live determines a bunch of other things that are sometimes counterintuitive. It determines what kind of air you're going to breathe. It determines what school you're going to go to. It determines whether or not your house is going to appreciate and at what rate your house is going to appreciate. So a house is actually embedded in a whole set of complex systems. And so when I talk about housing, and I've done this in Massachusetts, I've actually done it for the whole state, we talk about housing being the hub of a set of opportunities linked to a complex system. And we mapped out the whole state of Massachusetts to say, where are high opportunities and where are low opportunities in the state? So again, we don't normally think in this way. We don't normally think in terms of, sometimes we look at individual behavior. Individuals are within interpersonal relationships, which are in institutions, which are in larger systems. And so part of it is to, in a sense, understand how all those systems affect us and how they affect individuals. If we don't do this, we run the risk of not only misunderstanding what the issue is or what the problem is, we also run the risk of fixing the wrong problem. So too often when we see a problem in this country, we're so individualistically focused that we immediately go to the individual level. How do we fix, in terms of schools, how do we fix black kids? And the assumption is that if they're being expelled, then, maybe something's wrong with them. We need to sort of fix them. And it's hard to think that 3-year-olds need to be fixed, right? We might say, okay, everybody knows that teenagers of any stripe may or may not be fixed, That old joke about when Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac, and they said, well, how old was Isaac? And I said, does anybody know how old Isaac was? Well, I don't know either, but he was under 12, or it wouldn't have been a sacrifice, right? Sorry for that. The point is that at some point we know that 2- and 3-year-olds are not the problem, that there's a structure. And the story this morning sort of tells us a little bit about that structure. So it's important for us to think about what's the nature of the problem. So if you lose your credit card, you might say, okay, you're kind of clumsy, if you have your credit card stolen, well, you did everything you were supposed to do, but you're interacting with someone and they stole. So now there's someone else involved. So we're going to deal with pickpockets. What if you're being charged interest rates too high on your credit card or too high on your housing? It may be that you've done everything that you need to do and you still can't get good credit. Now that's an institutional problem and you can't fix it by telling someone, keep an eye on your credit card. And what if there's no banks in your neighborhood and they're not making loans in your neighborhood? So when we think of the credit problem or the housing problem, too often we actually think at the wrong level. So they had this huge meltdown across the country in terms of credit and housing. And the solution that some people thought of was we need to teach Latinos and blacks and poor Asians more about financial literacy. The solution was, how do we fix those people instead of looking at what's going on with the structure? Now, to give you an extreme version of this sort of suggest how absurd this is, there was a case in New York involving Goldman Sachs brought by the federal government. The federal government, Goldman Sachs apparently issued some security. They asked the banks to issue some securitized loans, some loans that they would securitize and sell in the bond market. And they knew those loans would be targeted toward the black and Latino community. Billions and billions of dollars of loans. They issued a perspective that no one could understand. They had a theoretical mathematician write up the perspectives to make sure that no one could understand. This is not, you can't make this stuff up. The first perspective, the first draft of the perspective was too clear. Goldman Sachs sent it back. They said, someone read this, they'll understand it. Send it back. They sent it back and then they got one they liked. All right, no one understands what this means, even if you're a sophisticated Wall Street broker. And then they sold these securities on Wall Street and they took out insurance that these securities would fail, that the housing would not be sustainable. And they won. And so the housing was foreclosed, and the United States government sued on behalf of Wall Street investors who had been fleeced by Goldman Sachs. And actually, literally, I went to DC and talked to some folks there, and I said, I'm like any other American. I can feel bad for Wall Street investors. They're people too. But what about the homeowners who were largely black and Latino? No one's suing on their behalf. And so we sue on behalf of the Wall Street investors. We didn't say, let's make all the Wall Street investors go back to school and learn financial literacy. We said, here we have a systems problem. But when we talked about black homeowners, it was a personal problem. So it's really important of understanding where we are. And part of this understanding comes from how we see people. And it's something I call the circle of human concern. There's certain people that we look at as people, and there's certain people that we don't look at as people. Now you might say that's a little extreme. I mean, who would you not look at as people? The good news is we can measure this. This is not analytics. There's a part of the brain that lights up when you see another human being. There's certain groups that when we see them, this is a national survey, when we see them, that part of the brain does not light up. And it would be the people you might think. Oftentimes, it's people who are poor. It's people who are incarcerated. It's people who are immigrants. It's people who, and so literally, now you can ask someone, you see that homeless person? What do you think of them? Do you think this is a human being? Of course, all of us are sophisticated enough to say, of course, that's a human being. But for many of us, when we see a person who's homeless, the part of the brain that lights up simply does not light up. And it's hard to make policy for people who you don't think of as people at an unconscious level. Now, this is actually interesting, a little movement, which means the unconscious and the conscious can be pulling in different directions. We can consciously believe, yes, this person is a human being, and the unconscious can be say, I don't see it. So this has been done. This is work of Susan Fisk up in Princeton. She has this model where she measures how warm we feel towards someone and how smart we think they are. And if we think someone's really smart and we really like them, then they show up as very high esteem. And the group that shows up most here in a national sample are white middle-class Christians. Now, you know, I guess, I don't know what being a Christian has to do with being smart, but anyway, that's the way we perceive it, right? And then there are groups that we think, well, they're probably pretty smart, but actually I don't like them. Asians actually fall in this group, international sample. Think, yes, okay, they can do math, you know, but they're kind of cold. I don't really like them. And I use the example as, up until very recently, there were very few Asian sex symbols in the United States. And about 2 years ago, there was a big story where they found, they went to China and they found some beautiful, and they said, an Asian supermodel. We found one. I said, China's only 6,000 years old. You know, I think there've been one before last week. And then there's a group that we actually like, but actually we don't think they're very competent. And that's people who are older. You know, it's like, yeah, my Uncle Joe is really nice, but don't get behind him in line, you know, and certainly don't hire him. And I must say, I'm guilty of this. You know, I travel in airports way too often. And if I get in a line and there's some older people in front of me, I change lines, you know, and that's a stereotype. Maybe they're slow, maybe they're not. But so we don't think, you know, we like them, but we don't think they're very competent. And that group we pity. And then there's a group that we don't like and we don't think they're competent. And at the extreme, this group is despised. And that's the group that falls outside of the circle of human concern. And so when we do planning, whether it's transportation or housing or schools, this group is not considered. We simply don't think about how do we make sure this group is attended to. This is actually a precondition for good public policy. We only have public policy for people or maybe even our dogs, things we like, not for others. So it becomes important. And I argue that the extreme, we're moving to a place in terms of the circle of human concern where inside the circle of human concern, we place corporations. And then all people get pushed out of that circle. And we end up having a hard time making good policy for people. So I call this the othering process. And how we think of the other also affect how we think of ourselves. We actually use the other to help define us. And you know, we like our own group. It was years ago, we'd say our own tribe, our own posse, our own family. And then everybody else is different. And all of us do this to some extent, but sometimes we actually use this as a strategy. And there's an article in today's New York Times by Paul Krugman, and he talks about using race as a strategy, dog whistle politics, which is the name of a book that a friend of mine, Ian Haney Lopez, just wrote, where we deliberately use the strategy of racializing and otherizing someone to create anxiety, to create policy about corporations, right? So you make the government weak and ineffective so that they can't regulate or tax. And the people who engage in this oftentimes are not necessarily racist in a narrow sense. It doesn't mean that they don't like black people. It's just a way of actually generating support for policies that will actually impact them in a positive way. Cass Nelson, who teaches at Harvard, has written a new book on this called Fear Itself. And he talks about how fear has been used to generate all kinds of policies in the design of the country and the economy. And it's counterintuitive because normally when we think of race, we think of it very narrow. It's like, well, am I treating you well? As opposed to how are we designing the structures and policies of our society, and what does this have to do with race? And again, it's not necessarily direct. It can be at an unconscious level. So I've talked a lot about the unconscious, but let me say a little bit more about it. So the unconscious is interesting. We all have them, but we usually don't know anything about them. So because we spend so much of our time, in fact, virtually all of our time at the conscious level, we assume that all the work that's important is happening at the conscious level. And what this says is that the human brain processes 11 million bits of information a second. And I usually get the question, so what's a bit? And I pick up your phone, and your phone will say, if you buy us, you get 50 million bits. You say, oh, great. And actually, most of us don't even think, what's a bit anyway? How many bits do I need? We just know that a big number sounds good. So your brain is processing about 11 million bits of information a second unconsciously. During that same period of time, the conscious is really cooking with gas, or with solar panels if you prefer. But it's only processing 40 bits of information a second. So while the unconscious is processing 40, while the conscious is processing 40, the unconscious is processing 11 million. So if you really want to know what's going on, you really need to get in touch with the unconscious. And the unconscious, as you might know, is super fast, and the conscious is very slow. It just can't keep up, which means a lot of things, which means, one, we can't control most of the stuff at the conscious level. It's too slow. So a lot of stuff happens, as it were, behind our back. So I'll show you a couple little games. You may have tried these games before, but here's another opportunity. I want you to just tell me the color as it appears on the screen. Just say it out loud as fast as you can. Is that clear? Forget the text. Don't look at the letters, just the color. Okay?
Blue, red, white, green, white, green, red, blue, white, green, red, blue.
Okay. So, very simple, right? Why is it harder when the color and the words don't cohere? The unconscious is largely habitual and automatic. And so now if these, and we actually do this, we actually do the same thing with the colors and the words, but they're in Greek. So since most of us don't read Greek, if you have the red color red up there, it doesn't affect your ability to actually read it. But you can't turn off the unconscious. It's automatic. And sometimes there's a conflict between what's happening at the conscious level and what's happening at the unconscious level. And when that happens a lot, it actually makes us tired. It actually affects us. They call it a cognitive depletion. And I say, when you're in a group, an interracial group, and there are people, particularly, and this we've actually tested this, so it's not just made up, it's a little provocative. When white people are in a group trying not to see race, it exhausts them, right? They go home, it's like, honey, how you doing? I'm tired. I've been not seeing race all day, So at the conscious level, it's like, no, I didn't even notice. I'm just tired. Why are you tired? I don't know. I was in a meeting today, a lot of blacks and Latinos, but I didn't notice they were black and Latino, but they did make me tired. So here's another little game, and some of you may have seen this before. I have to get over here to do this. This is not my computer, so nope, that wasn't right. Okay. I think it's this one here.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So I take everybody laughing that some of you didn't notice the bear the first time. Let me see if I can get back to the.
One on the right, I believe.
Okay. I use a Mac, and this is, as John would say, this is a doll. I was told to double click.
This is an awareness test.
Double clicking and it's not coming back.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Okay, here comes the expert. So let me tell you what just happened here with the moonwalking bear. So the reason you didn't see it, many of you I assume didn't see it, maybe most of you didn't see it. And first of all, let me just, well, I don't want to let's ask you how many saw the moonwalking
The answer
bear.
is 13.
Most people don't see it because
But
you were primed
did you
not to
see
see
the
it.
moonwalking
Remember I said
bear?
you can only process 40 bits of information a second? So what do we pay attention to? What do we notice? And in a sense, the speaker told you what to notice. He says, count, team in white. Your 40 is exhausted. You actually did notice the bear unconsciously. We can actually demonstrate that. But your conscious mind has been exhausted. Now, anything else that comes across the screen, you will not notice. It turns out this is called priming. We're primed all the time. We're told what to notice at a conscious level. We're told what's important. And that's what we notice consciously. Other things, and we're also told in some ways what's important at unconscious level. So we can prime not only for what we notice at the conscious level, we can also be primed to know what's important at unconscious level. And these primes happen largely in society. So in a society where the unconscious actually is really about what's called connections and network. When two things fire together, we start having an association. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So you may have seen this before. Let me just show of hands. How many people see a triangle in this? Okay, now I'm going to give you this PowerPoint to the folks who were kind enough to invite me here, and I want you to look at this carefully when you get home. But just take my suggestion right now. There is no triangle, right? Your mind is making it up. You don't actually see the world. You interpret the world. The mind interprets the world. And in fact, how many of you can see depth perception? Show me show of hands. How many of you can see depth? Right? So most of you, all of you, if you're driving, hopefully you can see depth, right? Your apparatus in your eyes actually cannot see depth. The information comes in your eye, it shows on a flat screen, it's actually flat. And if I had time, I could actually demonstrate this to you. Then your brain actually turns it into a three-dimensional phenomena. What you actually see is two-dimensional, your brain makes it three-dimensional. And because of that, we can do all kinds of tricks because you're not seeing, your brain is seeing. It's telling you what's there. And so you fill in what's supposed to be there, right? Just one other quick example. If you cover up one eye, so cover up one eye. Okay. Now, you've all been to see an eye doctor, And you know that there's a hole in your vision because where your nerves come at the back of your retina, you can't see. It's dead. So you have a visual hole in your eye. Do any of you see that hole right now? No. Your brain fills it in. Now we can show that if you actually do, when they do the thing where they show something on a board and it disappears, it goes into that spot that you can't see. But your brain doesn't like gaps. So where there's a gap, it fills it in. Not because you're seeing it, but because you're making it up. So the world you interact with is largely a world you're making up. Here's one other thing to be aware of. So I talk about the unconscious being habits. These habits are social. They're not individual. So this is actually counterintuitive. The unconscious is very social. The conscious is more individual. So we want to understand where we're getting certain habits. It's because they're repeated in the larger environment and then they get lodged into the unconscious, which suggests a number of things. If you really want to change something, it suggests changing the environment rather than getting inside of an individual's head and changing how a person thinks. So the fact that we have associations, habits, association, two things happening together fast, we build an association. The association only exists in our mind, right? So what's the relationship between a bell and eating? None, right? And yet we all have heard of Pavlov's dog. So after a while, you ring that bell and you feed a dog, you ring the bell and you feed a dog. Now you just ring the bell. The dog starts salivating because the dog has made an association at a unconscious level. And we are all, in a sense, dogs. I don't mean to, put down anybody, but our brain, our nervous system, and our unconscious is largely habitual. And in some ways, it's very fast, but not very sophisticated. And it exists at an automatic level. Just one other example I like to sometimes use. Remember when you first start driving, and you're driving, and hands on the wheel. I remember my experience. I'm driving, and things are just whizzing by. It's like, and my attention is riveted, and then my dad says, "Okay, now go up to 25," right? And then you stop after half an hour. You're exhausted because it's taken all of your conscious attention. So what happens is that after a while, you get better at that, and you put it on into your unconscious. The unconscious is actually doing all the work now. So now I can drive on the freeway, 80 miles an hour. I can talk on the phone. I can listen to the radio. I can have a conversation, and it's all good most of the time. So part of it is that the things that are fast, most of them get lodged into the unconscious. So how do we transform the unconscious and structures? How do we actually develop solutions that can address communities that actually, so what I'm suggesting is the decisions we make and interactions are happening at a non-conscious level. They're happening in two different places. And let me just parse that out for you a little bit more. So I've talked about the unconscious, and I've also mentioned structures. The unconscious is actually how we interact with each other. Structures is what's happening even without human direct involvement. So they're actually two different things, but they both can point in the same direction, and they both play off of each other. They interact with each other. So the reason this is important is that the way we approach issues of race is that we try to be neutral. I don't want to see race. I just want to treat everybody the same. That should not be the goal. And it's not really possible. So we want to move beyond just treating everybody the same. Again, that's a conscious effort. It won't work. It can't work. So what's an alternative? How do we then want to treat people? Now this is very counterintuitive because we've been told our whole life, one, not to see race, and two, to treat everybody the same. But treating everybody the same doesn't recognize that we're situated differently. Right? If we're situated differently, then you don't want to treat everybody the same. There's an example. You get a message. There's some people out in the middle of the ocean. you need to get out there. Well, I'll be out there in 2 days. Well, the people on the ocean liner in 2 days, they're probably going to be fine. The people in this little boat, they're not going to make it. So we need a different way of approaching it. One of the slides I have, I don't have it in this presentation, I have it from New Orleans, and there are people in a car, and the caption, the picture is real, the caption is mine. The caption says, here comes that damn tide. And at the top of it is, rising tide lifts off boats, and then you have a picture of a car, and the people are saying, here comes that damn tide. Because if you don't have a boat, a rising tide is not going to rise you, right? The assumption of that statement is that we all have a boat. And so if the tide rises, we all will rise with it. But what about those of us who don't have a boat? What of us don't even have a car? What about those of us who can't swim? And so it turns out that that metaphor actually doesn't work. And it doesn't capture the fact that we're situated differently within structures. Again, thinking about Katrina for a little bit more, the evacuation plan for Katrina was to get in your car and leave. And it wasn't until after the flood hit that they realized that almost 40% of African Americans didn't have cars. They had what I would call a universal strategy. Everybody in America, get in your car and drive as fast as you can. Oh, wait a minute, there's some people in America don't have a car? How did they become Americans? So what we do, what I call for is targeted universalism. And targeted universalism says we have a universal goal. We want to get everybody out of the way of the coming flood. But the strategy has to be targeted based on how people are situated. Based on how people are situated. So we know, for example, that structures can hold us down and create inequality. When we look at that, most of the time our response is we want to be neutral. Structures are never neutral. Structures not only can hold us down, structures can promote us. And we need promotions or different pathways to the same outcome, right? So a pathway that might work for one person will not work for another person. So what we really want is everybody to get up here. But the pathway of getting there will be different for different groups. And we only understand that when we understand how they are situated. And we're situated in some complicated ways. So one of the things, we're all in networks. Every human being is in a network. And networks are different. How do you get a job? 85% of jobs is by word of mouth, by your network. But I'm in a network where I don't have a job and nobody I know has a job. So I'm out of luck. Only 15% of people actually go to the want ads or to get jobs. Most of us actually, it's like a friend says, oh, they're hiring here, and that's how I get a job. If I'm in a network that's connected, and this is actually real, this is mapping networks, and then we have a network over here that's very isolated, which means they're getting no information. And so if you want to know how people are differently situated, we're not only differently situated in structures, we're socially differently situated. And this is so important. Let me give you one example. They've actually found through some studies that among black youth and white youth, certain populations, they have the same sexual practices in terms of frequency and in terms of using contraceptives. But in this case, the black youths are more likely to get sexually transmitted disease because they're in a thicker network. It's the networks that are different, not the individual behavior. The network is distributing outcomes differently because of the difference in network. And we just don't see that. It took social scientists and scientists years to try to figure out why is it that blacks are getting sexually transmitted diseases more often. The first answer that people gave is, well, because they're sexually more active. It turns out, no, that's not the answer. Well, what else could it be? Maybe they're not using protection. That's not the answer either. So it took us years to realize it's actually because they're in a different network, and in this case, the network is thicker. So information is traveling faster. So there are just hundreds of examples like that once we start looking for them. But we usually don't look for them because we look at individual behavior. And our interventions are largely individual. So let's assume that we want to have people interact, engage with the Taj Mahal, right? So here comes someone, there's a fence there. Here comes someone who's 6 feet, or over 6 feet, and the fence is only 5'9" or whatever. So he stands there and he can look at it. What do they do, right? That fence is actually discriminating based on height. Now, when a person built the fence, they didn't say, I want to make sure no one over 5'9" gets a view of the Taj Mahal. They just built the fence. But it's discriminating based on height. So what do you do if you're trying to make sure that everyone can see the Taj Mahal on that side of the fence? What do you do? Excuse me?
Take it down.
You can take it down. You could take the fence down. You could also give them a bench, right? So now, everybody can come get on a bench, and unless they're really short, they can see the Taj Mahal. Except, what if you're blind? In that case, taking it down and having a bench probably doesn't work because the person can't see. So if you have a universal goal, we want people to have an experience of the Taj Mahal, and now you have a blind person, that person is situated differently in relationship to a person that's sighted. And again, it's not that people saying, what do we do? So one example might be you give them a physical experience of the Taj Mahal. But each one of those is different and is based on people's situatedness. It says nothing about one person is more worthy than another, but it's actually looking at how structures actually enhance or retard people. Another example I use oftentimes is if you have a wheelchair, if you have an escalator trying to get to the 3rd floor, everybody can stand on the escalator, then here comes someone in a wheelchair. The escalator doesn't work. The escalator is discriminating against someone in a wheelchair. Or cutaways, right? And a few years ago, if you're trying to walk down the street and you get up to a street curve and there are no cutaways, you're in a wheelchair, or you have a stroller, right? So structures are constantly interacting with human condition in a way that actually creates a differential that we have to pay attention to. So the whole thing of targeted universalism then is to really understand how we're situated differently, and then to address that to reach those universal outcomes. And not simply assuming that everyone's in the same situation. So I'm going to go through some of this quickly and now sort of try to apply it to transportation. So this is a heat map of how people of transportation in the United States. And so people are moving and they're connected. And of course, transportation is about connection, right? It's about how do we connect people to something else? How do I get connected to my job, to my place I shop, to whatever? Until very recently, we used to map transportation grids based on distance. And we say, if I'm 5 miles from a hospital and you're 5 miles from the hospital, we are of equal value from the hospital, right? We don't do that anymore. What do we do now? Time. Why do we do time instead of distance?
That's what's important. I mean, that's what I care about when I'm going somewhere.
Okay. So I don't know if you can hear him in the back. He says, we don't do distance anymore, we do time. So close. So why do we do time now instead of distance? Why don't we just measure distance and say 2 people 5 miles from a hospital have equal access to the hospital? Why isn't that not true?
Because one person would be going 5 miles uphill, and the other person would be going 5 miles downhill.
That's right.
The method has changed already.
Okay.
If there's like a pressing issue and they need to get to the hospital quickly, and one particular trip is going to take longer, then they're going to find it harder to get there, even if they're about to die or they really need.
So it could take much longer. And we've already talked about cars, right? So poor people are less likely to have a car. 5 miles for them can be like, oh yeah, my baby, I'll get my 3 kids in a stroller, and now I'm walking 5 miles in the snow, right? Whereas I get on a subway or I get in my car, 5 miles is, 20 minutes I'm there. And so what we find is that the time is a much more realistic indication of how a transportation grid is working. And I flew here from San Francisco. It's a long ways. It was, 5 or 6 hours. But what if I had to walk? Right? It's still the same distance, but now we're talking about months. So what we're moving towards, that connectivity is largely not simply about space, but about time. And there are different kinds of connections. So transportation is always about connection. Are you connecting? And the connections are uneven. And so there's some connections that are relatively thick and some connections that are relatively thin. And what we find is that poor people and vulnerable people are the most disconnected. And they're most pressed for time. And so, if you don't have a car, and we talked to some of the people from the Bard and Ham Foundation about this. If you don't have a car, and I'm not advocating cars, and you got to get here to the daycare, and over here to the school, and over here to your job, it's hours. And I have another map, and I think I put it at the end of the slide, but I'll give it to you. We've actually mapped where poor people live in the Bay Area. They live the furthest away from jobs, and they're least likely to have transportation, and they're least likely to be on a subway line. So now they can get to the job, but people are commuting 2.5 hours. That's just to get to the job. So that's 5 hours. If they have to do anything else, it's the whole day. And then it's like, those people aren't coming to the PTA meetings. They're working 2 and 3 jobs. And then just in terms of time, they're radically situated differently than the rest of the population. There was a young man from the Central Valley of California. He's Latino. He came to Oakland. We had a meeting there, and he's probably 25 years old. It was actually very sweet. He was like in a 8-story and 10-story building, and it's like he was, wow, this is really an amazing experience, being in this tall building. And look at all those tall buildings over in San Francisco. And so a lot of the young people were going up to San Francisco to party in the big city. And I saw him the next day. I said, so did you go to San Francisco? He said, no. I said, why not? He said, I couldn't afford it. The cost of getting on BART, which, I have one of those automatic things. I don't even think about it. Just take it out of my paycheck every, whatever. But for him to pay $4 each way to go to San Francisco and back was prohibitive. So in that case, it wasn't just distance. It wasn't even just time. It was also cost. Now, and of course, in terms of systems, we all know about feedbacks. But some feedbacks are quick. I eat something bad and I get sick. It's okay, I'm not going to eat that anymore. But if feedbacks are not tight, that is, I do something today and tomorrow I'm okay, and the next day I'm okay, and then 10 years from now, I get cancer. And someone says, well, it's that thing you ate 10 years ago. It's what thing I ate 10 years ago? I didn't eat anything 10 years ago. So when there's a long time lag, we're not good at making relationship or causal connections. And one of my favorite is pregnancy. And some of you may know this already, but we only found out about 8,000 years ago that sex had anything to do with pregnancy, because there's this 9-month lag. And it's like, someone said, like, yeah, look at that woman, she's getting big. I mean, wow, that's pretty cool. But it had nothing to do with me, And literally, so for the first 2 million years on the planet, 2 million years it took us to figure out that sex and pregnancy had anything to do with each other because of the time lag. And this whole fight around global climate change, right, is that, as you know, the scientists say the effects we feel in the day is what we did 30 years ago, not what we did last week. And it's like, oh no, that's not reasonable. And people who reject that, it's not that they're just being obstinate, is that it's hard to actually believe that something that happened 30 years ago with all these different factors is only coming out now. Computers are better at that than the human mind. So what we try to do is actually deal with this in the positive, and that is to say, not just remove barriers, but to affirmatively support people to have certain outcomes. And we actually do this through what we call opportunity mapping. So we map out opportunity, looking at things together. And it's actually a very simple concept, and the federal government is finally getting around to actually adopting it. But I can tell you I've had many conversations with the feds, Democrats and Republicans, about this. Simple example. Federal government still builds a lot of affordable housing, and it cares about kids going to failing schools. But most of the affordable housing that the federal government builds is in school districts that are failing. And when you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. I'm building a house for families with children, and I want them to go to a good school, but the house I'm going to build for them is in a failing school district. And this is budget neutral. It's like, well, why don't you build a house where there are high-performing schools? And the housing people say, we are concerned about housing. We're not thinking about school. We're thinking in silos. And then they say, if your school keeps failing, you can try to get out of that school district. But how do I get out? You just built me a house next door to the school. Well, you figure that one out. And so here is some opportunity maps that we did in the greater Boston area. And these are, I think, 14 different composites, including transportation. But so here's the low opportunity areas, and here's the higher transportation opportunity areas. Now, they always get this thing of, so are you saying that poor people, particularly people of color, should move out? That's not what we're saying. But we are saying that we should be conscious of people's relationship to opportunity. And not just a relationship spatially, but can they actually use the opportunity that's available spatially? I always say, if you live next door to a hospital, it doesn't mean you have access to good medical care, right? Because you might not be able to pay the bill. Let me just check and see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, so I have about 10 more minutes, then I'll be done and we can have some dialogue. So here's the opportunity. Low opportunity areas are the lighter areas. Darker opportunities are the higher opportunity. And then here's where non-white populations live. So overwhelmingly, they live where they start off with much less access to opportunity, both spatially and also in terms of the cost. As you can see here, 90% of African Americans and Latino households are isolated in lower opportunity areas. And he said, how does this happen? And I heard that Boston is sort of going through this revitalization. And what happens in places like Boston and San Francisco is that all this resources coming in, all this, quote unquote, potential opportunity. And basically we say to people, I know you've been living here 20 years, but we're getting ready to have a lot of opportunity in this area. You got to leave. You need to move somewhere where there's no opportunity. It's just problematic. I'll just leave it at that. And again, just more maps sort of demonstrating the same thing. And this is true all over the country, and it will be true unless we affirmatively do things to interrupt it. So one of the places I'm involved is Minneapolis. They're building a number of light rail lines in Minneapolis. The first impulse was to build a light rail line that would skip where people of color live. Now, it wasn't simply because they didn't like people of color. They said, well, they don't have enough money anyway. They can't afford to get on, and they don't have the density demand to actually put a stop there. So why should we stop there? And we're trying to work that through. We haven't worked it through entirely, but we are trying to work that through. So if you think of transportation policy as housing policy, you could even say think of transportation policy as employment policy. If people have access to transportation, well, the only place in the country where black women actually got off welfare almost at the same rate as white women was in New York, and it's because black women had access to transportation. Black women as a group are the most isolated group from effective transportation of any group in the country. So if we're trying to do stuff in terms of employment and schools, we have to sort of think about that population being situated differently than other populations. So what do you do if you want to try to link that population up? So here's just some time charts. And we can see there's a huge disparity in terms of time. And as they say, time is money. Obviously, a huge disparity in terms of housing costs. So this is actually from a colleague of yours here, Dr. Pollack, who does really good work. So again, we have to link all these things together and make sure the cost is working for various populations. Now, I've been talking a lot about black people and blacks and Latinos. Let me be clear. I'm not suggesting that you only focus on blacks and Latinos. I'm saying you focus on everybody. What do you need to actually create a system where everyone can get to the finish line? And what I'm saying is that we intuitively do that for white middle-class families, and then we think it's neutral. It's race neutral, it's gender neutral. Everybody has a fair chance to get on the escalator. And it's not true. And so then we bring the attention to blacks and Latinos, like, well, why are we talking about race? You know, this is about transportation. This has nothing to do with race. So again, it's important to see when we talk about how groups are situated, we end up talking about race, we end up talking about ethnicity, we end up talking about gender. One of my favorite examples in terms of gender is that when we defined work in the 1930s, we excluded certain categories from work. We excluded domestic, we excluded home care, and we excluded agricultural. So if you stay home and take care of the kids, that's not work. And it just so happened the way we define work was what men do. If women do it, it must not be work, right? My wife stays home all day and plays with the kids. Well, I go out and work, you know. And I can tell you I have kids myself and my daughter. I have a granddaughter and she's wonderful. But I can tell after a while my daughter was like, get me out of the house. You know, I need to go to work. I need to get away from my sweet little baby. So part of it is even definitional. But groups are not situated the same. And that's the point. And so if we were to redefine work, we might define, we say we care about families, we care about kids. So why do we define work that if you're taking care of kids and family doesn't count? Why do we define work that if you're taking care of your elderly, sick parents, that's not work? You lose all your benefits. And anyone knows if you're paying for that, that is not only work, that is hard work, that's God's work, and yet we don't monetize that work. So part of this is to think about this at every level in terms of budget allocation, in terms of workforce, in terms of fee structure. Now, there's a big issue that I want to leave with you, and that is that if we think about the market, we'll just say there's certain people that the market doesn't work for. And it used to be that we say the government needs to subsidize housing, needs to subsidize transportation, but the government actually is in trouble now. We have tax policies, we have spending policy, so that the government can't sustain the growing population that can't use these services that are necessary to have a good life. I believe we have to think about a market that actually internally subsidizes so that everyone can participate who wants to participate. And not just say, here's the market for people with money, and the people without money, you go to the broke government and figure out what to do. This is a capital operation and ridership. And again, we see that people of color don't use these services as much as whites. Here's just some plans, some things we might talk about. How do we spend money? How do we make sure that every group, so when we're spending government money, public money, that every population has access to it? I met with a group earlier today and I said, so how did the black community do on the big dig? That was a huge, what was it, how many billions of dollars? And the people I was talking to were not happy. So part of it, again, is to be proactive. It's not enough to be neutral. Because when we be neutral, what we end up doing is then we rely on the way these structures actually allocate things. And we've already seen that these structures don't allocate things in an equitable way. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions or comments.
We have 2 mics in the room.
And tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Angela, and I'm a graduate student at Northeastern University. My question is more about your concept of targeted universalism, especially maybe in suburban communities. I'm sure most of us are aware that the suburbs are becoming poorer, but there's still a lot of policy that's being targeted towards people who are more affluent or are still the middle class. My paper that I'm working on right now is actually looking at transportation in suburban neighborhoods, trying to bring transportation, but also realizing that lower income neighbors and Blacks and Latinos that are living in these communities do not have the power nor the privilege to really ask for transit to really start targeting their neighborhoods. So how can I really try to navigate that really kind of tricky situation of wanting to say, yeah, suburbs need more transit for these neighborhoods, but also not leaving a certain sect like in the dust, I suppose?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I guess I would say a few things, and I don't have enough information, but I would do basically, and I'm sure you're doing this, a transportation need for the entire population in a certain area. And not just the current need, but projected need. So here's one of the things that I really support public transportation, and I'm glad to see it's happening finally in the United States. But it's probably inadequate. I'll give you just a quick example. The largest cohort, depending on how you divide people up, the largest cohort, the fastest growing cohort in the United States and the world are people over 65. People in the 40s, not over 65, people in the 40s in the United States, 4 times more people today than 1980 are using some kind of crutch or cane largely because of weight. Which means we have more and more people in America who are not ambulatory, which also suggests that the public transportation grid we're building is not going to serve the largest growing population in the country. So I start with transportation, not from a car, or not from a light rail, or not from a bus, but from the needs of the people. That you really have to start from, what does the population need? And then, how do you actually link them up based on that need? And so if we could start there, as opposed to, we have a transportation system, but this group can't use it. Start with the group, and then think about a transportation system that actually would serve them. And part of that may then also back us into things like housing. And so in Portland, for example, they basically say you can't build a large employment facility unless it's on a transportation grid. And if you want to do that, you actually get fined because they're saying, we know, what employers sometimes do, they build where there's cheap land. The land is cheap, and then they say, we need infrastructure. And the state said, well, maybe we have it, maybe we don't have it. But then they have more cars on the road, or they have people isolated, or it serves certain population or not. And I think it's particularly important to start with the population who historically are underrepresented and don't have a voice, because it would be hard to hear them because we're not in touch with them. Like the population I just described in terms of who will be housebound, who, we have a large number. I just went to a thing in the Bay Area, and it was interesting, it was very interesting, but this population of people over 65 who will increasingly be non-ambulatory, not on the people's radar screen, just not on their radar screen. Add race in that and other issues, and we're talking about just excluding, planning to actually not serve a large portion of the population. So I would start there. Now once you have that information, you then have a political problem. Because now the good thing about people that's over 65 is they vote. But it's not always true for immigrant populations, it's not always true for black populations, it's not always true for Asian. So if they're not necessarily organized, but they vote. So you have a voting bloc. So it's hard to totally ignore that group because eventually they will vote. But so the question of how do you actually then deal with power and planning. And the last thing I'll say is that what people do sometimes, they'll say, well, we built for people with money. And people without money, what are we supposed to do? And that's what I was saying about you make the market work for everyone. So if you're building a transportation grid where you say, if you're a senior citizen, if you're a low-income person, you get access to the transportation grid at a cheaper price. That the higher, that those, and that's the way we've always actually, society's always worked. But historically, it was the government that served that role. But if we're going to have a weak government, the government can't do it. We have to do it some other way. So I think really lifting up the need is the first start.
Thank you.
My name is Price Armstrong. I work at MassDOT in the Rail and Transit Division. So thank you for a very interesting presentation.
You're welcome.
One thing that I was thinking about, especially when I was looking at the map of Boston that you had with minority and then white population and distribution, I was thinking about some of the major transit projects that are going on in Boston. So there's like Assembly Square, which is a major Orange Line project, the Green Line extension. And I guess what I was coming to, they talk about these projects as really unlocking a lot of economic development potential. And getting to what you were saying earlier about sort of the politics of transit decisions, the Somerville area is like a rapidly gentrifying, it's a rapidly gentrifying city. I don't know, I mean, it's definitely double-digit housing inflation cost. But then when you look at like the Dorchester, Mattapan area, which is where you see most of the African-American population in Boston, it's mostly served by bus. I guess my question, my question is, what's the argument? So from a politician's point of view, my understanding is there's a tremendous amount of latent market potential. If you install a transit station on the Orange Line, you're unlocking billions of dollars of investment. Is it erroneous? I mean, is it being short-sighted to say that the same couldn't happen in the other neighborhoods of Boston, or what is the argument that you make to electeds or decision makers for more equitable investment?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know Boston obviously as well as you, but I met with some people early today, and they were saying they're worried about the traditional black community because they're afraid of two things. I mean, one is you say they're being ignored, right? But when they're not ignored, it's that the land will be seen as valuable, but not the people. Right? So it's like, okay, we're going to build. You know, I was in Portland, and they started building bike lanes, and people in the historically Latino community call them white lanes. It's like, you know, we're going to have to leave. They're not building that for us. They're not thinking about us. And so part of it is to actually both take care of the people's needs, but allow them to actually participate in the growth. Now, the thing that's harder is that by definition, if you're talking about a poor community, it can't support, even if it has a population density, it can't support the economic investment. And so what we've always had, countries that work well and societies that work well, is that we do cross-investment. You know, you could say, well, you know, you're a kid, you can't afford to go to school. You know, wait till you get older and you get a job, then you can afford to pay for school. We don't do that, right? We say we invest in our kids, and then our kids become productive, and then they become, you know, and then they become less productive, they retire. And the idea is that we're actually supporting both ourselves, but we don't see those kids as our kids. We see them as other people's kids. And eventually we even see they're living on some valuable land. And I mean, if you go to Harlem today in New York, I mean, which is, I know New York better than I know Boston. So they had the stop and frisk law in New York. That was really driven by the influx of a lot of money and a lot of white people into Manhattan. And it's like now we got all these blacks and Latinos and Asians. We need a lot of police. So if you go to Harlem today, it may be a little bit better in de Blasio, but I don't think, not yet. You go to Harlem today, I stay in Harlem sometime, and I stay at the W, which is a pretty fancy hotel. And I say, when, you know, white people move to Harlem, and I don't have nothing against white people, I want to be clear, but they give them, you know, a police escort. You know, it's like, and so now you go to Harlem, you see fancy strollers and police and stop and frisk for black people who've lived there forever. It's like, you know, we want to make sure the street is safe for these white people. And it's like, it's really corrosive. And I think we can't function as society unless we see ourselves socially supporting each other at different stages of our life, at different income levels. So one argument against building in these areas right now would be they don't have the economic wherewithal to support a line. So we're going to support the line but if you just do it on that, you're going to always just serve the elite. And the elite is actually getting smaller and smaller. And as some of you may know the data, white middle class is actually shrinking. So it's not just white people, it's that the middle class is actually shrinking. And then you get a very divided society. So I think that we have to sort of take this on. And first of all, so the planning for it and the politics of it are different. And I think we have to deal with it at both levels, at the planning stage and the political stage. And I think Portland has tried to do a pretty decent job. As you know, they have urban growth boundaries, and they give things like density bonuses. So from a planning perspective, we know how to do it. What we don't know how to do it from is a political perspective. That's much harder.
You're actually touching on my question. I was wondering, your ideas make a lot of sense to me, but that's because I share your values. And I was wondering how much traction these ideas are getting in any particular city. Are there cities where, not just the planners, but the politicians, where there's a community of people who see themselves as responsible for and invested in what happens, whether it's in a city or a state? But are you finding any areas in this country that are embracing these ideas as an entity and actually internalizing them in their planning?
Yes, I mean, I think it's uneven, but yes, I mean, I mentioned Portland, I'll mention Denver, and it's uneven. I mean, certain population, Seattle, although Seattle is actually becoming whiter, even though the state is becoming less white, the city itself is becoming more white. It's becoming more expensive to live in Seattle. And it's actually interesting because what you have in a place like Seattle and where I live, San Francisco, you have young, hip, urban whites wanting to urban experience, and they don't have, I don't think, necessarily a strong racial aversion, you know, but they have a lot of money. I mean, San Francisco is crazy. They just built an apartment down the street from where I live, and a one-bedroom apartment starts at $8,000 a month. You know, and they're actually, so it's not just black people or Latinos, they're actually starting to be demonstrations against the Google buses and, you know, because like, who can afford to live here? And so it has to be planned. And San Francisco has an enviable position is that you don't have to worry about, you know, it's like, well, people are still trying to get in the city. But you have to plan for it, and it can't just be market driven. And it used to be that we'd say the market is for the people who have money, and then the government will actually subsidize the people who don't have money, right? But we weaken government so much now, the government can't play that role. So what I'm advocating is that we restructure the market and make the market self-subsidizing. And Portland's done a better job of that than a lot of cities. It's not perfect, but and a lot of stuff going on, but they're trying at least. And so they have inclusionary zoning. Think about a place like New Jersey. New Jersey has a thing, what's it called, fair share housing. So no matter where you live in New Jersey, if you build so many units, 15% of them has to be below market rate, 5% of them has to be for poor people. Montgomery County, which is the third richest county in the United States, has done this for years, and it works. But it has to be planned. It won't happen just, quote unquote, based on market. You have to actually affirmatively grab onto this and say, we're going to have a society that's racially, economically open to all people. We're not going to be Paris. You know, and if you're in Paris, you know, it's a lovely city if you have money, but all the poor people live in the suburbs. And we're starting to see that in places like the Bay Area, where Latinos and blacks are getting pushed further and further out and have longer and longer commutes. And the Bay Area is a very liberal place, but we have to actually affirmatively plan it, because we've structured a market that will completely push people out. I mean, I live in San Francisco, I have a son there, and I'm getting ready to I teach at Berkeley, so I'm getting ready to probably move over to the East Bay, and my son is like, Dad, you can't leave, you know, there's only 4 of us black people left. And I say, fine, you take care of it, I'm going, you know. It's like, and San Francisco is not a, you know, a hostile place in terms of race, but these mechanisms are in place that unless you interrupt them, unless you plan for them, they won't fix themselves.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? I totally agree with you, so I guess what I'm asking, what I'm asking is, do you have a strategy for how to actually, because these are structural issues, and also the time frames are different.
Right.
Do you have a strategy for how you actually make entry into, whether it's a city, a region, that do you try to, is there a community that you're, because it's not even just one person.
Right.
So are you thinking about what kind of community has to be convened and really built to be thinking about and internalizing these values so that they're working collaboratively together and over time to do it? That's what I mean.
Yeah. No, I think, yes. And I mean, there are a lot of us thinking about this, and we need more help, so we invite you into the conversation. San Francisco is interesting. I mean, now they're literally people attacking the Google buses. And I think it's the wrong focus. It's not the people on the buses. There's a structure that's actually propelling something. And so how do you get a handle on it? And people at Google, they don't think of themselves as bad people. You know, they're sort of hip, and, you know, I have a Google on my, you know, computer as well. But it doesn't happen naturally. You have to put something in place, or it will actually create the kind of society that it will create Paris, right? Different places have tried different things. I talked about New Jersey doing inclusionary zoning, Portland having urban growth boundaries, but to say deliberately that this is what we want, so let's build transportation grids that serve all of us. In Portland, if you want to build off of transportation grid and you're a company, you get a serious fine. They say you have to build on the transportation grid. You have to build on transport. We don't want cars on the roads. So they make that part of their planning, and it's actually pretty good. Again, not perfect. It's only recently, though, that the housing and transportation planners got together around issues around race. For a long time, Portland had a huge fight between the people who were in favor of civil rights and the people who were in favor of transportation planning. And they saw each other as, and I was sort of a bridge between those two populations. And it was an interesting conversation, because they were saying, the people who were doing the transportation, like, you don't care about the environment. You want more cars on the road. In San Francisco, where I live now, they like the idea of having a diverse city. It's just not a reality. You know, I live in a place where one of the quote-unquote really hip districts, the guy who does Facebook is not far from me, just bought a house. His third house in the Bay Area. I mean, it's like, it's not a third house in the country, it's third house in the Bay Area. And that house cost $30 million. He tore it down to build something else, right? It's in my neighborhood. So if you can spend $30 million on a house, tear it down to build your real house, You know, there's something going on. So the market is not going to fix that problem. We have to be very deliberate. I think it was Mark Zuckerberg or whatever his name is. Zuckerberg, right? And I don't think he's a bad person. I don't know him personally, but he's given billions of dollars away. I'll stop after saying this. I live on Dolores Park, if those of you know San Francisco. They just passed the law in San Francisco that you can no longer sleep in the park if you're homeless. So literally, I live right in the park, so now people are sleeping in my doorway. It's like, they're going to have to sleep somewhere, and I understand, you know, you're walking your dog and running, and you don't want to step over homeless people in the park, but you want to step over them as you step out of your doorstep. And San Francisco is interesting because the Tenderloin district is shrinking, right? Which is where, so it has to be deliberate. That's one of the things I'm saying. It won't happen. We've created structures that will naturally, without people being mean, in this case, people being very hip and whatever, they will, the forces will actually drive San Francisco to Paris. And it's not what people really want. So we have to be very deliberate. So things like inclusionary zoning, that if you build a house, how do you make the $30 million house subsidize the SRO? How do you do what Portland is doing? You say you have to have a transportation grid if you want to build. Portland turns away businesses if they won't build on a transportation grid, because they're saying this is the kind of, you have to plan it. You have to be much more deliberate about it.
Hi, I just have a quick...
Where are you?
I'm over here.
Oh,
Quick,
okay.
sorry. My name's Sugo Gagnon. I live in Dorchester and work on the North Shore, so I have about a 20-mile commute. I'm a great supporter of public transit, but it doesn't serve anybody that well, and we're still so car-centric that the result of that is if you have a car like I do, and if it's actually cheaper to drive to work, you're going to drive, people like me are going to be driven out of the system, which doesn't seem to me to bode well towards expanding it. So how do you cope with that?
Well, you know, one of the things that I was saying is in terms of poor people, first of all, people are unevenly situated, right? So we did a study in terms of, I mentioned about low-income black women. The best way to get them to work and around is actually a car. Now, an environmentalist, and actually I talked to people from the foundation about this, and they said, well, no, we don't want any more cars. And I understand that, because long-term you hurt the environment. But short-term, that population, if you're dropping your kids off at daycare, and then, you know, you're going somewhere to work a long way, and then you're trying to go shop, and you're in a place where there's not a good transportation line, the time factor is killing you, right? So you have 3 kids, they don't all go to the same school. You need a car. And we said, no, we don't want cars, and I get that. You know, it's hurting the environment. And you know, we all need the environment, right? We all need an environment still. So we have different needs. And part of it is that we sort of talk past each other. So the fight in Portland, they, again, the environmentalists are saying, poor people and black people, they don't care about the environment. And you know, the blacks and Latinos were saying, you know, these environments, they're racist. And neither of those things was really quite true. But people were situated differently. And that's why I spent so much time in our presentation about trying to get people to understand how they're situated differently. And so it may be that either a short-term solution or needs-based solution, right? If I want you out of your car, how do I make sure you have access to what you need and you can get what you need? That's the deal. You're saying, I'm willing to get out of my car at least most of the time if I can still have a decent life. But if I can't, now again, I talked about people in their 40s. There's been a 400% increase in people in their 40s who are not ambulatory. That's not going to increase. So if you're on, if you have a hip replacement and a bad knee, you're not going to be bicycling. You know, and so it really just to sort of drill down and look at how people are situated differently. We're not all situated the same, and we don't see that. You know, I moved to San Francisco, and I was in a restaurant, and I was, you know, probably flirting with a woman. Not even probably, I was flirting. And then at the end of our conversation, it was a nice conversation, I said something like, well, how do I drive from here to X? And she said, you have a car? And I said, no, I'm asking for a friend of mine, you know. But it was that thing, it's like anybody who's really hip doesn't have a car. But, you know, I'm still pretty mobile, but a lot of people are not. And so part of it is we see our own situation, and we have to create a political process where we can see each other and where we serve everybody. And the market as it's structured now is serving fewer and fewer and fewer people. And so, and I know we need to stop, but there are attacks on Google buses in San Francisco. To me, that's wrong, because we don't want people off those buses and everybody driving, but people see that Google is bringing so much money into the city, it's distorting it for people who don't make. My son lives in San Francisco. He makes over $100,000 a year, and he feels poor, you know, because there's so much money in San Francisco. Well, that's not a sustainable system, because, you know, even if you make $500,000, you still need someone to cut your lawn, you know, to whatever. So how do we build a system that's deliberately inclusive of all of us? So that's where we have to go. So some people might, if you don't want them to have a car, then how do we solve the problem? And it's not get him on a bicycle. You know, you're not going to be riding on a bicycle if you have a bad hip and if you have 4 kids. And so how do we actually build something deliberately for all of us? I mean, that's the challenge. And I'll stop by saying one last thing. I think this is not just a local problem. I think there is uneven. There's cities like Boston and San Francisco and Seattle. There's also, when I leave here, eventually I'm going to Detroit. Detroit's in a very different situation. It doesn't have a public transportation grid at all. It doesn't even have buses. So how do we actually think about that? And then, of course, we have to think on a global level, because really these issues don't know borders anymore. They bleed across different borders. And if we have long-term solutions, it has to actually be attentive to the fact that, you know, if we can solve the pollution problem, but if the Chinese don't, it doesn't matter, right? Because the pollution that they make in China is not going to stay in China, and we can't tell them. I'll stop after this. Japan has figured out how to burn coal cleanly. They haven't given the technology to China. Now, there are a whole lot of reasons why that makes sense, but it's also stupid, because the air in China is not staying in China, right? So it's like, so we need to sort of figure out, how do we actually think about creating these sustainable world where no one's really left out? We can't say, I want a sustainable world in my gated community, but sorry for the rest of you. That's not going to work. So I think that's the kind of things we have to start moving forward to.
So I want to thank John Powell, Dr. Powell. That was really a fascinating talk. It was so fascinating that I forgot we were supposed to finish. And for those, since nobody here was bored, if you want to stay on board, there happens to, that's not just a graphic, that is his book, and it will be for sale right over here. So please come and buy it. I would just end by one note. I've done a lot of planning in New Orleans since Katrina, and if you want to see a city that is paying a price for not dealing with racial inequity issues, it is the wonderful city of New Orleans. And most recently, we spent some time studying, about 2 years, possibility of taking down something called the Claiborne Expressway, which is an aerial expressway. Think of our central artery. And the good folks who live in the neighborhoods on either side, who pay a very significant environmental price, basically said, no, don't take the expressway away. Do not improve the quality of life in our neighborhoods, because we won't be able to stay here. And so a city that desperately trades on its heritage and its culture is sitting there with an elevated expressway that nobody wants, but the folks who have the real political say are afraid to let go of it, because there go them. So anyway, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. So.